Okay, I want to welcome everybody to this webinar event, The Unbiased Truth. And what I want to talk about is how to know the game and win the game. And of course, we'll really get into what all that means. So the context of our discussion today is really kind of at a macro level, what is going on between America and China, the current trade war, all the areas around the world where China is challenging the US, and there are tensions between these two countries and how our leaders are reacting to that. But this is not going to be a political discussion, and it's not even going to be discussing things at a macro. These are all givens. Okay, so it's given that China is rising. It's given that China matters. Their influence in everybody's lives can be felt. The most latest saga is, Daryl Morey of the Houston Rockets, general manager, tweeted about the democracy protests or movement in Hong Kong in support of democracy, and then there's a huge backlash from Yao Ming and the China Basketball Association, and suddenly the preseason games are not going to be broadcast, and all the China sponsors have kind of suspended their relationships with the NBA. Okay, so China matters. But at an individual level, as we talk about how we do business in China, how we negotiate, how we communicate, and how we form our relationships, it's important to understand what it means when we say China attitudes are evolving, and how as China has become more assertive and more confident on the global stage, individual Chinese behavior has also become more emboldened. And a lot of that will affect how we should approach our engagement and interactions with Chinese people. Okay, so today during the formal session of this event, which is what we're doing right now, I'm going to talk about some of the cultural biases that we have. When I say we, I'm talking about Americans and by extension, Westerners. So if you're Chinese and you're listening to this, you just have to put yourself on the other side of these biases and try to figure out how our mindset, our attitudes affect how you can improve how you engage with us. So that would be the other side of this coin. And when we get into cultural biases, we're going to talk about what are the controllable remedies that we might have. So obviously, most of you and most of the things that are happening in the geopolitical macro level on the global stage between our two world leaders, these are all uncontrollable things. And as much as we want our leaders or wish our leaders would take a different approach, it is really mostly beyond the realm of things that we can influence. So this discussion, it really focuses on us as individuals and how we communicate and build relationships with other individuals. The average Chinese person that you might do business with, the average Chinese employee that you may have, the average Chinese partner that you might be negotiating with. And the things that I really want to talk about, because we don't have a lot of time and each one of these could be separate case studies on their own, is I'm going to talk about our unknown unknowns, things that we don't know, and why it's important for improving how we do business in China. Some tactics that you can employ, especially you can try these tactics as a way to start to better understand the nuances of Chinese culture and Chinese behavior, and how you can improve how you actually accomplish your goals or achieve the outcomes that you want to achieve. And then we're going to talk about mindsets. So it really is part of a series of things that we call a mindset for China business. But I'm going to bring out a few examples of mindset adjustments that you can make that will ultimately lead you to being able to work more effectively and achieve more favorable outcomes doing business in China. And then at the end, we'll really get into the live Q&A. A lot of you submitted really good, what I call the number one burning question about what's going on between U.S.-China relationships and how you should make the what type of adjustments you should make to kind of your approach. Okay, so I want to start by saying, and this is important because we're going to talk a lot about mindset, and I'm going to start by saying that we are all biased. It is really just an inescapable human condition that we all have biases. Okay, and the question is whether the biases are deliberate or they're subconscious. And are we aware of these biases, and are we aware of our behaviors as a result of these biases? Okay, and the macro context obviously is what's going on between America and China and how that affects the rest of the world, how that affects geopolitics, global economics. But I think the main point that we want to stress here is whether these two sides can actually achieve a long-term sustainable way forward is kind of beyond our control. Now, obviously in America, we can vote if we don't think the current administration is doing a good job, but in practical terms, it's really beyond our control. And the reason that I say that is because one of the things that we really want to talk about is what is controllable and what is uncontrollable. And what I always recommend to my clients and students and partners and employees and whatever is we always want to only focus on the things that we can control. And the majority of the time, the things that we can control is ourselves. So a lot of the things that we're going to talk about now are the adjustments that we can make in our own behavior. And this is what I mean by know the game, play the game. So when you are an American or you're a foreigner and you're going to China or you're engaging with Chinese people, if you don't understand the culture and the rules of the game and how the system works and how the rules are enforced and how people think, then if you don't know the game, you're not going to be able to win the game. You're not going to be able to play the game. Okay, so know the game, win the game is really the key to what we're going to be talking about today. Okay, and the real goal of knowing the game and winning the game is how to influence outcomes via our relationships or vice versa. How do we improve our relationships vis-a-vis the outcomes that we're focused on? So this has a lot to do with attention, okay? Are we really focused on strategic objectives? Are we focused on KPIs? Or are we focused on more kind of soft objectives that really aren't measurable, but I think have a greater impact to, number one, the relationship, and number two, ultimately, what we're able to achieve working together with somebody from China. Okay, so the cornerstone of everything that we do in China, and I'm sure every one of you has heard this term, you know this term, and you probably practice this term, and it's called Guanxi. But what I've observed is a lot of Americans or a lot of Westerners, while they know this term and they know the definition of this term and they know how important it is, they don't understand the nuances of it. Okay, and if you don't understand the nuances of it, then a lot of biases will creep in, a lot of judgment and negative judgment will also enter into the lexicon of how you respond to certain things that you may or may not agree with and not understand it in the context of Chinese culture and doing business in China. And that gets me to the other half of the title of this webinar, and it's called the unbiased truth. And what do we mean by unbiased truth? Obviously, we all want to try to be as unbiased as possible, but as we know, that's really not possible because we're all human. Okay, so what adjustments can we make to try to get as unbiased as possible? And for most Westerners or most Americans, I would say you want to try to evolve from an absolute truth worldview to one of relative truth. Okay, this is one of the biggest dichotomies between how Chinese people think and how Americans or Westerners think, and that is our definition of truth and whether we believe in absolute truth or whether we think in terms of relative truth. And once we are able to kind of reconcile these differences and start to look at a different perspective of the same event, what's going to happen is we're able to make adjustments to the things that we can control. And these factors that we can control are our attitude, our mindset, and our approach ultimately. And these are the things that ultimately will influence perceptions and outcomes more than anything else. And because people respond to how they feel. People don't respond necessarily to what you say. What you say affects how they feel, but ultimately their perceptions are the things that you should really be focused on if you want to achieve the greatest advantage for yourself and your organization. Okay? So what are the fundamental key questions that you should be asking as you're trying to figure out, well, it's all very nebulous. How do I make adjustments to my attitude, mindset, and approach? So the first question is, what level of awareness do you have? Are you aware? Are you self-aware? Okay. Are you self-aware means, do you know how you are perceived by other people? And are you aware of any cultural biases or even prejudices that you may or may not have? Okay. So the first step is awareness. And the second step is, do you actually care? Okay. If you're aware that they would perceive certain American values as contradicting their system of values, but the question is, in the context of the relationship, the context of developing Guanxi, the concept in the context of the partnership, do you care? Right? And that really means, do you care how other people think and how other people feel? And in another word, are you able to be empathetic to Chinese people, given that you disagree with their rhetoric and their nationalism and their perceived corruption and all of these other things that most Westerners kind of just naturally espouse when they talk about Chinese people? Okay. Are you able to be empathetic to why they think and behave that way? Okay. And all of this leads to what I think is the classical definition of insanity. Okay. So most expats, foreign expats who are doing business in China, they will always encounter frustrations, but more importantly, they're going to encounter unexpected disappointments. Now, I call these China leadership dilemmas, but we're not going to get into that. But the question is what I've observed is most people have what is a standard MO, a standard modus operandi. And when they are surprised or when they're disappointed or when they can't kind of get the outcomes they want and people don't respond the way they respond, the tendency is to get angry and to get frustrated and to pound your fist and try to leverage whatever power or authority that you have. And I think that's the classic definition of insanity, because what you're not doing is you're not trying something different and managing, controlling, or adjusting the things that you can't control, which is your attitude, mindset, and approach. So this insanity is really an outcome or a symptoms of things that we don't know. Okay, these are our unknown unknowns. Things we don't know. And when you go to a foreign country, this is a phrase that was coined by Donald Rumsfeld during, I think, the first war in Iraq, where they couldn't explain the quagmire. And the only way to explain it was that there are things that we don't know. There are unknown unknowns. And this analogy has often been used by Westerners doing business in China, because when you go to China, there are many things you don't know. And what I'm going to do is there's obviously infinite number of things you don't know, but I picked out a couple that I think will provide some greater perspective and context to ultimately what we want to achieve, which is more favorable outcomes. On the other side of our unknown unknowns is really our myopia. And on the other side of being myopic are the detriments of myopia. And the reason that I want to kind of share some unknown unknowns is for you to try to conceptualize how this could impact how you do business in China and how people actually respond. And the only really way to do that is to use imagination, because a lot of times if you lack imagination, you're not able to figure out why certain things are different. And of course, it should be really positive imagination. And then the second thing is curiosity. And we often say purpose-driven curiosity. So if you lack imagination and you lack curiosity, it's going to be really difficult to overcome your myopic tendencies. And again, I'm going to share some really is to provide a little bit of context and help you on your journey to develop a wider or greater perspective. And the first one I'm going to talk about is behavior. Okay, so a lot of Americans and a lot of Westerners get frustrated with what they consider bad Chinese behavior. And so I want to put into context what people respond to and why behaviors are differently. And this is not something, this one is not something that I came up with. I read it somewhere and it just made perfect sense based on the things I was experiencing when I was doing business in China. And that's basically that in China, well, in America, people obey laws. This is the way that we grew up. Okay, we're afraid of the police. We're afraid of breaking laws. We're taught to obey the law or there could be consequences. But in China, people obey people. Okay, so that is why it's more important to develop the quote unquote Guanxi relationship with the authorities and the people who adjudicate the outcome of whether you committed a crime or violation or not. And depending on what side you're on, you may not suffer a penalty or a consequence. So this contrast that in America, people obey laws, and in China, people obey people, this is a really good frame of reference and something that a lot of people don't know. They don't know what are the ramifications of this type of mentality. Okay. The second unknown, I think, is trust. And what do I mean by that? It means that what is the basic definition of trust? So from an American point of view, when I trust somebody, I trust you to be honest. I trust you to be truthful. I trust you to be open. And I want to partner with somebody who's going to tell me when things are going bad so we can respond quicker. Okay. So whether you are truthful, whether you are honest, has a lot to do with whether I can trust you or not. Now, in Chinese culture, trust is completely different. Okay. Trust has nothing to do with honesty. It has nothing to do with being truthful. Okay. Again, because the way to explain it is Chinese think more in relative truths than absolute truths. And the Chinese, when they decide whether they can trust you or not, they trust you when they feel that you will give them the maximum advantage, benefit, insights, or inside information possible. Okay. It's a system based on reciprocity, the continual exchange of goodwill. So generally speaking, that is what Chinese people trust. That's why they trust their family more than their friends, and they trust their friends more than foreigners. It's because of the expectation of goodwill and reciprocity. So this is another things that a lot of Americans don't really comprehend, and I call it also one of the unknown unknowns that is really poignant as far as really understand the differences or the dichotomies between US and China. And the third one, again, there's a lot of these. And this one, I thought I'd talk about the fifth. Okay, so The fifth is, in American culture, the fifth is the Fifth Amendment. Okay, and that means if I've been accused of a crime and I'm in front of a judge or I go to trial or whatever, one of my basic fundamental rights is I don't have to self-incriminate. Okay, I can refuse to answer a question if I believe I may incriminate myself, and that is not even an admission of guilt. It just, I plead the fifth. By answering this question, you could interpret it the wrong way and judge me as actually having committed a crime. So I plead the fifth. Okay, so Americans have the right not to self-incriminate. This is completely the opposite in China. Okay, Chinese people have no such thing as the Fifth Amendment, but not only do they not have the Fifth Amendment, it is generally advantageous for Chinese people when they've been accused or arrested for a crime to kind of confess and admit to doing something wrong. And oftentimes they have to admit to doing something wrong even when they haven't done something wrong. And it's strategic. The reason why they do that is because by doing the opposite of pleading the fifth, which is actually admitting guilt even when you may not be guilty, is that you can get a much less severe punishment by admitting to something even if you didn't necessarily commit the crime. Okay, so that's just a huge dichotomy in the mindset of what Chinese people think. And if you are a foreign manager in China and if you've ever had something go wrong and you try to ask your Chinese employees or staff or managers what happened, and you have a hard time getting an answer, you're either getting silence or you're getting a lot of excuses or rationalizations, it's all comes from this fundamental thing where in China, you don't have the right to plead the fifth, which is refuse to say something that might be self-incriminating. Okay, and again, all this is just to give greater context and perspective to help you ultimately make adjustments to your attitude, mindset, and then approach. But before we get into that, you know, the whole reason for doing this type of webinar and the initial presentation is really to talk about how to know the game and win the game. Okay, so the tactics that a lot of you can try to employ, it's just to start, these are tactics that you can start thinking about because it will be beneficial. Okay, and the first one is to give praise. Okay, and obviously you hear a lot of Chinese people giving praise, compliments here and saying this here. Ultimately, it comes down to giving face. A lot of Americans have a tendency to think that giving praise and the way that Chinese people talk is very disingenuous. Some people even say it's dishonest. Again, relative truth versus absolute truth. But if you can start developing a tactic of just praising people within the nuances of Chinese culture, that will serve you very, very well. Okay. If you have something bad to say, I would reserve it. And if you can think of something good to say, then say it. And that is the general tactic that I think if you're new to China, you can try to adopt. And if you're a seasoned China veteran, there are probably things that you can improve upon. And hopefully this will help trigger some imagination for you to think about that. Another tactic that I often advise my clients, especially during negotiations, is to be deliberately vague. Okay. Is to be deliberately vague. Sorry about that. And the reason to be deliberately vague is when you observe Chinese people and the way they communicate, and when you ask them a direct question and you're not able to get a direct answer, what happens is you're really frustrated because you think they're being very vague or they're just kind of talking in a circular manner and the conversation is going in circles. Well, there's a method to that madness. And once you start to realize what is the advantages of being vague, then you'll start to understand why they speak that way, how to interpret why they speak that way, when they speak that way, and how to adopt this kind of strategy yourself about being deliberately vague. And the general thing that I always say is that it's not, you have to imagine that it's not to your advantage to put all the cards on the table. It's not to your advantage necessarily to inform people exactly how you want to do business and where you draw a red line and all of these things. By being so specific, what it does is it actually alters the behavior of the person on the other side. And why does it do that? Because in Chinese culture and in the Chinese mindset, there's always an expectation that there's going to be this exchange of goodwill and reciprocity. And that goodwill and reciprocity happens not in the letter of the law or the guidelines of the contract. That goodwill and reciprocity happens in the gray areas. Okay, the areas that are kind of ambiguous. So that's the reason why Chinese people like the deliberate vagueness or the deliberate ambiguity, because in this ambiguous gray area, there are opportunities for some people to be given an advantage over other people. And that's why one of the keys to success in China is being able to manage the different shades of gray. But as a tactic, this is an explanation of why sometimes it's in your best interest to just be deliberately vague. And you have to develop the ability to resist that tendency or that compulsion to make sure that everybody knows exactly how you feel and what you stand for. None of that benefits you doing business in China, especially if you're negotiating or even if you're leading employees. It's just not to your advantage to do that. So another tactic is to be deliberately vague. And the third tactic is to be deliberately silent. Okay, and you'll observe this a lot. So you have to have imagination and curiosity. You'll observe Chinese people sometimes in response to certain questions or inquiries, especially if they're difficult, they'll just be silent. Okay, and that's because there's actually no advantage to saying something. It's almost like damned if you do, damned if you don't. It's better just to be silent. And one of the things that all of you, especially if you're starting off doing business in China or negotiating with Chinese people, is to really understand the art of being deliberately silent. And that's going to be a tactic that you can use in many different situations. We're not going to get into them here, but in this short webinar, I just want to kind of trigger your imagination and start thinking about some of these tactics. And then the final thing is obviously the mindsets. The first mindset is it's not about being right. Okay, so a lot of Americans and a lot of Westerners, and I've worked with German companies, especially Germans. Nothing against Germans. I love Germans, but there's a tendency that you want to be right. But in China, that's a terrible mindset because you're never going to be right because there's no absolutes. Okay, it's not about being right. And that's a mindset that you have to develop, because once you start thinking in terms of right or wrong, yes or no, then you're taking a very Western approach to try to play the Chinese game, which makes it very difficult to win that game. And that's why we say one of the mindsets is not about being right. Okay. Another mindset that you have to also kind of start to adopt or realize is important is the tendency to be righteous. Okay. Don't try to be righteous when you are doing business in China. Don't try to spread Western values because it doesn't make any sense. Chinese people have different values. They're entitled to have different values, and they didn't grow up in the same environment that we did. They weren't educated the same way we were. and they don't believe the same things we believe. That's the rules of the game. And when Westerners go into China and they go in to spread values and to be righteous, that leads to all sorts of repercussions and ramifications. And most of them will just lead to a more difficult path to get what you want done, accomplished. Okay, so the second mindset is not to be righteous. And of course, the most important mindset, and I wrote face here, but I could have I could have also written values. Okay, so one of the things that leaders talk about a lot, servant leaders, people, influencers, is how do you deliver value? So the mindset that I always have is I want to give more than I receive. I always want to make sure I'm delivering value to the community, delivering value to other people. And ultimately, sometime in the future, that's going to pay me back. But if I expect to be paid on the front end, I'm going to be disappointed. So the mindset is always to deliver value. And the question is, when you go to China, what does it mean to deliver value? And that is really to understand, well, what do Chinese people value? And the way to think about it is Chinese people value their face more than anything else. Okay. Now, sometimes giving money or giving a raise or giving a promotion or being invited to dinner, there's monetary value to that, but it's also giving face. So giving valuable things that we would think is valuable and giving face, they're not mutually exclusive. But the mindset that you should adopt is that Chinese people value their face above money and above everything else. And there's many different levels to giving face. So the first is giving face to the individual or the person. The second is obviously giving face to people that this individual or individuals have associations with. So giving face to family members, parents is so important because it's the closeness of the relationship to that individual. And giving face to the country, giving China face. So you'll hear that China uses this term a lot in the news. They talk about you cannot disrespect China. We're going to defend our rights. You know, you think it's just rhetoric, but the way to internalize this when you're dealing with individuals is that's a majority of the way that Chinese people think. When China as a country is disrespected on a global stage, Chinese people will take offense. And if you express opinions like the Houston Rockets general manager about what's going on in Hong Kong, while I'm not going to say that what he said was necessarily bad, and of course I'm not against freedom of speech and freedom of expression, but it's just you need to understand what are the consequences and what are the ramifications, because Chinese people get to decide for themselves what they value and what they care about. And one China, and whether Hong Kong is part of China, whether Taiwan is part of China, whether Macau is part of China, whether Xinjiang is part of China, and what that all means and how they want to govern that. Well, that's just people in China think differently than people outside of China. And that's probably the most important thing, mindset that you have to really get your mind around. And if you want to be right or you want to be righteous, that ultimately is going to not serve you very well when you're doing business in China. All right, so this is kind of the formal part of the presentation, the unbiased truth, what that means, how to know the game and win the game in China is really about making the mindset adjustments so ultimately you can adjust your attitude and also adopt a new approach or modus operandi when you're doing business in China. Okay, so now what we're going to do is we're going to get into the question and answers. There's a lot of submitted questions, so we're going to kind of go through some of those. And so I want to thank everybody for attending this webinar. I hope that I've given you some ideas and inspiration about where you can actually make some changes, okay? Because in order to achieve a different outcome with your relationships and what you're trying to do in China, you have to do something different. Because obviously what you've been doing or what you're accustomed to doing, your standard MO really isn't working. So think about what are some of the things that we talked about. Feel free to reach out to me to schedule a chat. You can email me at info@emechina.com. I have a lot of content on the website, emechina.us. There's a blog, a lot of information in the blog. I have podcasts on Apple Podcasts, SoundCloud, and of course a YouTube channel, and it's all sharing content, ideas, and webinars about how do we know the game and win the game when we're doing business in China, and how do we reach the unbiased truth when we are negotiating or communicating across cultures. Thank you very much.